Good morning, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for the very kind invitation to provide a presentation, a helicopter view about food security, closing yield gaps, and sustainable intensification of ag systems. Before you ask me, I want to clarify about my last name, because as you can probably tell from my accent, from my last name, and from the way I dress, I'm not an American. Indeed, I am from Argentina, but my parents are from Italy. And to make things more complicated, I moved to the US about 12 years ago, and I got married with an Italian. And then I have a daughter who is American. So to be honest, I'm not sure where I'm from anymore. But it's a kind of mix between Italy, Argentina, and US, which could be good or maybe not. So anyway, I'm going to talk about one of the biggest challenges that humanity has ever faced, which is to try to feed our growing population on existing cropland area and do it in a way in which we mitigate the environmental footprint. So when we talk about food demand, there are basically two major drivers: the number of mouths and what those mouths will eat. So let's first try to explore what will be the likely increase in food demand over the next 30 years or so because of increasing population. So this figure here shows trends in population, historical trends, and then all the projections as derived by the models of the United Nations. Let's focus on the red line here, which represents the median scenario, the most likely one, although it keeps they keep changing it year after year. Based on this trend, we see that we are expecting to reach 9.8 billion people by year 2050, which represents an overall increase of 32% in population compared with the 2015 baseline. So 32% more mouth in only 30 years from now. Now, these trends are going to look very, very different depending in which particular country we zoom in. So if we look at high-income countries like Europe, US, Australia, you can see that the population increase is going to be quite small. And those countries are going to reach replacement rate quite soon, which means that the population is not going to increase any further. Now, the picture is completely different in the case of low-income countries, in which population will actually more than double in only 30 years, and then will keep increasing after year 2050. So again, understanding these dynamics in population by country and by class and by type of country is very important to understand how the extra food demand is going to come from. So basically, we are saying that the people that we are going to invite to the global dinner in the next 30 years are going to mostly come from low-income countries. Now, as I said before, it's not only about how many people there are, but also what they eat. And there is this very classic, robust relationship between the per capita consumption expressed in calories intake per day, so, and the level of income per person, which is here represented by the per capita GDP. So you can see that in the low range of income, there is a steep response in terms of caloric intake. Basically, in low-income countries, every single extra dollar that people will make, they will use it to eat better, which means that they will probably start eating more livestock products like meat, like eggs, like dairy products, and so forth. At mid or high level of income, this response of caloric intake to GDP start to level off. But again, if we say that most of the future population increase is going to come from low-income countries, that means that those countries are going to be here. So there are not going to be only more people in the world, but also those people are going to tend to have richer diets. And if we put together population increase plus change in diet, we can come up with our own conservative estimate of food production increase over the next 30 years of around 50%. Now, the uncertainty around this number is huge, okay? And many of you may be thinking that we can bring this number down by, for example, reducing our meat consumption, or by reducing biofuel production, or also by reducing our food waste. But as I hear in one of the presentations earlier, timing is of essence here. So whenever we evaluate some of these options to reduce our food demand, we need to consider that some of these proposed changes won't occur tomorrow. It will take even generations to make people change their diets or to reduce their food wastage. So understanding the timeline for impact is quite important when we analyze options to reduce our food demand. And also, again, it's important to remember that most of the population increase will come from low-income countries who are currently eating a very small amount of livestock products and who should eat more meat, right? We want those countries to eventually move up in this curve. So our target is therefore a roughly 50% increase on food demand over the next 30 years. Now, to meet a certain production goal, there are basically two pathways. You can you can meet that demand by producing more by expanding your area under cultivation, or you can try to meet that production goal by increasing your productivity level, by increasing your yields on existing cropland area. So this very simple figure simply illustrates that you can reach a certain production goal by having a large area with low productivity, or by having a small area with very high productivity. And the process of increasing production through extensification, through cropland area expansion is here represented on the y-axis, while the process of increasing production by increasing our yields, which we refer to as intensification, is here in the y-axis. And there are many reasons why we want to move in this direction rather than this one. One of them is that if we want to minimize the encroachment of agriculture into natural ecosystems like savannas, wetlands, peatlands, or rainforests, therefore it's important to try to produce as much as possible on existing cropland area rather than producing more by expanding our agricultural frontier. The question is, how are we doing? Are we now increasing our production at the expense of increasing our yields, or is at the expense of increasing our cropland area, or a combination of both? So let's try to explore the pathways that we have followed in the past to understand a little bit about how the future looks like. So I don't have really good news here in terms of how successful we are in terms of intensifying our crop systems. If we start by looking at the chart on the left hand, you can see there the average yield, the average land productivity for our 4 major commodity crops, soybean, wheat, rice, and maize, over the last 5 decades or so. I chose these 4 crops because they roughly account for about 70% of the global calorie intake. And there are many reasons why our diet is based on these crops. It's not just by chance. But one of the most striking findings from this analysis is that the rate of yield increase over time has remained stable over time. That means that the annual yield gains at the beginning of the Green Revolution in the 60s or 70s was about the same of the rate of yield gain that we have nowadays. So the yield of our major food commodity crops are increasing at the same rate as 40, 50 years ago. Now, are those rates sufficient to meet the 50% increase in food demand expected over the next 30 years? Well, the question is no. Because when you express these rates of increase relative to the yield level at a given point of time, you can see that those rates of increase represent roughly 2 to 3% of the absolute yield level in the early 60s or 70s. But they fall now to less than 1.2%. And they will keep falling as long as our rates are the same and our yields keep increasing, and will quickly fall below this 1.1, 1.2% that we need to reach by year 2050. If these lines fell below the dotted line here in this inset, that means that we are in problems. It means that we cannot meet the 50% increase in food demand on existing cropland area. That doesn't mean that we are going to run out of food. It means that we are not going to be able to feed the world on existing cropland area, and we are going to have to rely on expansion. But the whole picture becomes a little bit more pessimistic when we start to zoom in at a particular countries and cropping systems. So in this case, what I'm showing here are some examples of yield trends for rice, in this case California, rice in China, and wheat in North Europe, which show that in some cases there is evidence of yield plateaus. And we refer to a yield plateau as a long period of time over which there has been no detectable increase on average farm yield. So as you can see, for example, in the case of Northern Europe, there has been no increase on average wheat yield for the past 20 years or so. The same for rice in China, and the same for California. So that means that yields are not increasing at all in some of our most important bread baskets around the world. Just to give you some idea, China produces about 30% of the global rice, and we are saying that yields in China have not increased for more than 10, 15 years. So the evidence that our historical yield gain rates are not sufficient to meet food demand on existing cropland area, together with the evidence of yield plateaus in some of our major bread baskets, are telling us that we are not doing good, or we are not doing sufficiently good at trying to feed this world on existing cropland. And the consequence is this. The consequence is that we need to rely more and more on cropland area expansion. These are global trends for cropland area, for major staple crops here, including cereals, oilseeds, pulses, sugar, roots, fibers, and tuber crops in red. And this trend in yellow here only includes the 4 major food crops: soybean, maize, wheat, and rice. The message is the same. During the beginning of the Green Revolution, there was some increase on cropland area. That was mostly at the expense of increasing the crop intensity. That means we were able, through irrigation, to grow more crop cycles on the same piece of land within a year. So basically moving from single rice to double, triple rice systems. Then during the 80s, 90s, we went through a period of time in which actually the problem was that there was too much food, the prices were too low, and there was no really incentives to expand our agricultural area. That trend completely reversed starting in the early 2000s, a period in which we have seen a massive expansion in our cropland area at a rate of about 13 million hectares per year. So, in other words, every year there are a new 13 million hectares of land that are brought into agriculture. And the question is, where is this area coming from? Is this new cropland area coming from places in Europe, Australia, North America, or perhaps from somewhere else? Well, the answer is somewhere else. About 75% of the new area over the past 15 years has come from places in sub-Saharan Africa, South America, and Southeast and South Asia, places that host some of the most biodiverse ecosystems and also has very important carbon stocks, which means that once converted into agriculture, these systems will contribute a lot to further exacerbate climate change. And will also, and by the way, these new environments where agriculture take place, or where agriculture is expanding, they don't have the same productivity as the existing cropland area. The productivity is usually lower. As for example, in this case, you can see farmers in Indonesia. And by the way, I was very surprised to be talking so much about Indonesia today. This photo shows farmers in Indonesia growing upland rice in an area that was previously covered by forest. But you can see a lot of problems here. These farmers are growing rice on a steep terrain. That means that they're going to have big problems with erosion, and indeed you can already see problems here. And the productivity of this land is going to be so much lower compared with the productivity of, for example, irrigated rice in Java or somewhere else in Southeast Asia. So we are expanding our agricultural area, and we are expanding our area in more marginal environments where the productivity level is going to be lower. Now, let's try to put together what has been the contribution of yield gains versus cropland area expansion to the overall production increase during the past decades. So this figure here shows these pie charts, which has different portions in brown and green. The green color indicates what has been the contribution of yield gains to the overall production increase. The brown portion represents what has been the contribution of cropland area expansion to the overall production increase. I'm showing this pie chart for the 4 major food crops and for 2 time periods, from the 90s, 80s to the 2000s, and for the past 17 years or so. So overall, you can see that the brown color here has a smaller share compared with the green one, which means that during this time period, most of the increase in production has been at the expense of increasing our yields, increasing our productivity, except for the case of soybean. However, as I said before, since the early 2000s, this trend has reversed, and we can see now that the brown color has a much larger share compared with the previous period. So, for example, in the case of maize, in the earlier period, yield intensification accounted for about 70% of the overall production increase. In contrast, during the past 15 years, cropland area expansion has accounted for 2/3 of the overall production increase. Yeah, 4 minutes ago. Thank you. Big picture is that our increase, there will be about a 50% increase in food production in food demand during the next 30 years due to population increase and higher caloric intake in developing countries. Sorry, here it should say food demand, not food production. Our historical yield gains are not sufficient to meet food demand on existing cropland area. And there has been massive cropland area expansion during the past 15 years. And in many cases, this has been at the expense of forests, wetlands, and other very fragile ecosystems. So I think that if we want to be serious about feeding the world on existing cropland area without further encroachment into natural ecosystems, we need to be very explicit about the need for sustainable intensification of agricultural systems so that every single hectare of land produces near its potential, and doing so in a way in which we minimize the environmental footprint and we protect our resource base. And again, I'm not saying that intensification will immediately translate into land savings because that translation will require appropriate policies and institutions to make sure that intensification gains translate into land savings. So let's use this very simple framework to try to understand what's the idea behind intensification. We know that for a given piece of land, there is a yield potential which is driven by sunlight, by temperature, by the carbon dioxide level, and by, in the case of rainfed crops, by the amount of precipitation and the soil type. And farmers' yields are typically below this potential because of suboptimal management, because of incidence of biotic stresses, or simply because there are no sufficient nutrients. And we call this difference between the yield potential and the farm yield as the yield gap. Understanding the size of this gap is very important, not only for a farmer to understand where he or she is in relation with this potential, but also for, at a much bigger scale, to understand how much more food can be produced on existing cropland area in a given region. And by the way, we are not suggesting here that farmers should try to reach this yield potential, because if they go too much close to the yield potential, first of all, they will start losing money, and second of all, the environmental footprint is going to be just too high. But we know from working on cropping systems where farmers have good access to inputs, markets, and extension services that reaching about 70–80% of the yield potential is a reasonable goal for farmers who want to achieve high yields but also maximize their profit. Now, if we all agree that it's important to understand what the size of the yield gaps are so that we can inform investments on agricultural research and development, then we should all agree that it's important to understand what's the size of the yield gaps across cropping systems across the world. There has been some previous studies in the past trying to map yield gaps following a sort of top-down approach where basically you put together a many different sources of weather data, soil data, crop system data. You use some sort of statistical analysis of very coarse modeling, and you come up with these kind of beautiful maps that looks very good to the eye, but actually when you zoom into a particular region, they have very limited local relevance. And they're not really useful for making decisions at local level or to inform investments on extension and research for a given region. So we believe about 5 years ago that there was need to come up with an atlas of yield gaps that will follow a different approach. And we start working on this global yield gap atlas project where we derive estimates of yield gaps for major food crop systems around the world following a bottom-up methodology, in which we start by understanding where crops are grown in a given region. We use best quality weather data to estimate the yield potential because, as I said before, the yield potential depends on climate, so you need high quality weather data to estimate the yield potential for a given region. We spend a lot of time trying to understand the different soil types and cropping systems within a region because that will impact our estimates. We use well-validated models to estimate the potential yield, and by comparison of the simulated yield potential against actual yield, we estimate the yield gap. And this just, I have to start to wrap up, but this figure basically shows an idea of what's the size or what's the variation in the magnitude of yield gaps across different cropping systems with different socioeconomic background. So for example, in the case of farmers in irrigated farmers in the US, they reach about 80% of their yield potential. In the case of farmers in Argentina, they're about halfway of their potential. In the case of sub-Saharan Africa, they are well below, and their actual yield only represents 20% of what they could potentially achieve there following good agronomic practices. Again, finding a large gap doesn't mean that you can, by tomorrow, increase your productivity. Because, for example, in the case of sub-Saharan Africa, these farmers have very poor access to markets, to inputs, and to information. But having recognized that there is a large gap, that provides an incentive to invest in these areas, in these regions, to make sure that we enable all the mechanisms and the infrastructure, the infrastructure that is needed to allow intensification for this kind of systems. This shows a recent analysis for China, which I don't have time to explain now. But bottom line is that if we want to be more serious about producing more food on existing cropland area, I believe that we need to be more explicit about the need to intensify our current crop systems so that our farmers get yields that are closer to their potential, and they do that in a way in which they minimize the environmental footprint. And the atlas on yield gaps that we have developed over the past 5 years provide a good basis to inform investments on agricultural research and development that can eventually promote intensification in those regions where these yield gaps are larger. So having said that, I'm going to stop now, and thank you very much.
Since we are running out of time, I'll ask just one question of clarification. From Jeff Fox, commodity prices are at low levels today. Doesn't this explain the decrease in production?
No. No, and also I will be a little bit cautious in making a strong connection between yields and prices, because in some cases I agree that if there is a price signal, that will lead to a higher productivity because farmers will be more willing to invest into input, for example. But in some cases, the elasticity of the relationship is very low, and variation in crop yields is totally unrelated with crop prices. So I won't necessarily try to make a connection between prices and crop yields. Also, we need to also consider that prices are very variable across years, and therefore try to assign a particular price in one particular year with an overall trend over time is kind of a long stretch.
Okay. Thank you, Patricio.